The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes across the Montana plains, blanketing everything in white as far as the eye could see. Thomas McKenna stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, watching the stagecoach lumber up the frozen dirt road, his heart hammering against his ribs like a wild horse trying to break free. Inside that coach was a woman he had never met, a woman who had agreed to become his wife based on nothing more than a handful of letters and a photograph that was probably 5 years old. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, trying to decide if the cold he felt came from the December wind or from the fear that had taken root in his chest. The ranch spread out behind him, 200 acres of land that had belonged to his father and his grandfather before that, now teetering on the edge of collapse. The cattle were thin, the fences needed mending, and the bank had sent another letter just last week, stamped with words that might as well have been a death sentence. Thomas had tried everything. He had worked sunrise to sunset until his hands bled and his back screamed in protest. He had sold off half the herd, then 3/4 of what remained, just to keep the land, but it was never enough. The drought 2 summers ago had devastated the grazing pastures, and the harsh winter that followed had killed most of what livestock he had left. Now at 32 years old, he was a man with almost nothing, watching his family's legacy slip through his fingers like water through a sieve. The stagecoach stopped, and the driver climbed down, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. Thomas descended the porch steps, his boots crunching through the snow. The door opened, and a small gloved hand emerged, followed by a woman in a dark blue traveling dress, her face partially hidden by a bonnet. She was smaller than he had imagined, more delicate, with eyes the color of summer chestnuts that looked up at him with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Mr. McKenna." Her voice was soft, with a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "You must be Eleanor." "Eleanor Whitmore," she confirmed, placing her hand in his. "Though I suppose it will be McKenna soon enough." He helped her down from the coach. Acutely aware of how rough his hands must feel against her fine gloves, the driver hauled down 2 trunks and a smaller case, accepted his payment with a grunt, and climbed back onto his perch. Within moments, the stagecoach was rolling away, leaving Eleanor and Thomas standing in the snow, 2 strangers bound together by desperation and hope. "Welcome to the ranch," Thomas said, the words sounding inadequate even to his own ears. "It's not much, but it's honest land." Eleanor looked around, taking in the sagging barn, the empty corrals, the house with its peeling paint and crooked shutters. He waited for disappointment to cloud her features, for regret to darken those chestnut eyes, but instead, she smiled. "It has good bones," she said. "My father used to say that about buildings. Good bones can support almost anything if you're willing to do the work." They carried her belongings inside, and Thomas showed her to the small bedroom that had once belonged to his mother. He had cleaned it as best he could, changed the linens, even picked some dried wildflowers and put them in a jar by the window. Eleanor set down her bags and removed her bonnet, revealing dark hair pinned back in a simple style that framed a face that was more interesting than beautiful, with intelligent eyes and a determined set to her jaw. "I should tell you," Thomas began, the words sticking in his throat like burrs. "Things here, they're harder than I might have let on in my letters. The ranch, it's struggling. The bank, they're talking about foreclosure. I understand if you want to leave, if this isn't what you signed up for." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression serious. "Mr. McKenna, Thomas, I didn't come here expecting luxury. I came here because I needed a new start, just as you need one. In my last letter, I told you I had some savings. What I didn't tell you is why." She paused, her fingers twisting together. "My father was a businessman in Chicago, and when he died 6 months ago, he left me a small inheritance, not a fortune, but enough. My stepmother made it clear I wasn't welcome to stay, and the men who came calling were only interested in that money. I wanted to go somewhere I could be useful, somewhere I could build something real." Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, though whether it was relief or something more complicated, he couldn't say. "I won't lie to you about what we're facing. This ranch is dying, and I don't know if I can save it." "Then we'll save it together," Eleanor said simply. "Or we'll fail together. Either way, I'd rather try than give up before we've even started." They were married 3 days later in the small church in town, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple dress, the color of cream, and Thomas wore his father's suit, carefully mended and brushed clean. When he slipped the ring onto her finger, a plain gold band that had belonged to his mother, he felt the weight of every choice that had led him to this moment. This woman, this stranger, was now his wife, his partner, bound to his fate whether it led to salvation or ruin. The first weeks were harder than Thomas could have imagined. He rose before dawn to tend to the handful of cattle that remained, to chop wood, to repair what could be repaired with materials he scavenged and salvaged. Eleanor threw herself into transforming the house, scrubbing and cleaning, mending curtains, patching holes in the walls with whatever she could find. She cooked hearty meals from almost nothing, making soups and stews that stretched ingredients further than Thomas would have thought possible. They worked side by side in a silence that was sometimes comfortable and sometimes strained, to people learning to orbit each other in the small space of shared life. But despite their efforts, the ranch continued to slide toward disaster. The remaining cattle were too few to sell for any real profit, and spring seemed impossibly far away. Thomas lay awake at night, listening to Eleanor's quiet breathing from the other side of the wall that separated their rooms, wondering what would become of them. It was on a particularly bitter January morning, when Thomas was checking the barn for damage from the previous night's storm, that he discovered Eleanor's secret. He heard a sound coming from the tack room, a rhythmic clicking that didn't match any tool or animal he knew. Curious, he pushed open the door and found Eleanor sitting on an old crate, her fingers flying over a strange contraption of metal and thread. Before her, a piece of fabric was taking shape, the stitching so perfect and precise it looked like machine work, which it was. "What is that?" Thomas asked, and Eleanor jumped, nearly dropping the device. "It's a sewing machine," she said, her cheeks flushing. "A Wheeler and Wilson. My father gave it to me for my 16th birthday. I've been working on some things, just to keep busy." Thomas stepped closer, watching the needle pierce the fabric again and again, each stitch identical to the last. "I've heard of these, but I've never seen one up close. They say a woman with one of these can do the work of 10 seamstresses." "That's not far from the truth," Eleanor admitted. She gestured to a pile of fabric beside her, and Thomas saw that she had been making shirts. Sturdy work shirts with reinforced seams and careful stitching. "I brought fabric with me, and I've been practicing. I thought, perhaps I might be able to contribute something." Thomas picked up one of the finished shirts, examining the craftsmanship. It was better than anything he had ever owned, better than the shirts sold in the general store in town. An idea began to form in his mind, fragile and unlikely, but an idea nonetheless. "How many of these could you make in a week?" he asked. Eleanor considered. "With enough fabric and thread, perhaps 15 or 20, depending on the complexity." "Why?" "Because the men working the railroad camps, the logging operations up north, they all need sturdy clothes. Good clothes that can stand up to hard work. The store in town charges a fortune for shirts that fall apart after a month. If you could make better ones, sell them for less, we might have something." Eleanor's eyes lit up with understanding. "We would need to buy fabric in bulk, which means we need some capital to start." "I have a little saved," Thomas said. "Not much, but enough for a first order. Maybe." They made the trip to town the next day, using nearly every dollar Thomas had left to purchase bolts of sturdy cotton and denim, spools of heavy thread, and buttons and fasteners. The merchant, a shrewd man named Hutchins, looked at them skeptically. "You're planning on clothing the whole territory?" he asked. "Just providing quality for a fair price," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the gamble they were taking. That night, Eleanor set up her sewing machine in the kitchen, where the light was best and the stove could keep her warm. She worked late into the evening, the rhythmic clicking of the machine becoming a new sound in the house, a sound of possibility. Thomas found himself drawn to watch her, amazed by the speed and precision of her work. She made shirts and trousers, work gloves with reinforced palms, even sturdy aprons. Each piece was carefully crafted, built to last. Within a week they had their first inventory. Thomas loaded the clothes into the wagon and drove to the nearest railroad camp, where 300 men were laying track through the frozen wilderness. The foreman, a gruff man named Sullivan, examined Eleanor's work with a critical eye. "How much?" he asked. Thomas named a price, lower than the store but fair for the quality. Sullivan nodded. "I'll take 20 shirts and 15 pairs of trousers to start. If they hold up, I'll order more for the whole crew." The money from that first sale wasn't much, but it was hope made tangible. Thomas drove home with a lighter heart than he had carried in months. Eleanor met him at the door, flour on her apron from baking bread, and when he told her about the sale, she threw her arms around him in a spontaneous gesture of joy that left them both surprised and slightly embarrassed. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." "You did it," Thomas corrected. "This was all you." But Eleanor shook her head. "It's us. This ranch. This life. It's ours together now." Word spread quickly through the camps and logging operations. Men who had worn through 3 shirts in as many months found that Eleanor's garments lasted and lasted. Orders began to come in faster than she could fill them, and Thomas found himself helping in the evenings, cutting fabric according to her patterns, sorting buttons, packaging finished orders. They worked side by side at the kitchen table, their hands occasionally brushing, their conversations growing easier and more natural. As the orders increased, Eleanor hired 2 women from town, widows who needed work and had experience with needle and thread. She taught them to use patterns she had developed to maintain the quality standards she had set. The kitchen became a workshop. Then they moved operations to the cleaned-out barn, where there was more space. Thomas built tables and benches, installed better lighting, created a small business from nothing but determination and Eleanor's incredible skill. The money began to come in steadily, not a flood but a reliable stream. They paid off the most pressing debts first, then bought feed for the remaining cattle, then made the payment to the bank that had seemed impossible just 2 months before. Thomas watched his wife transform from an uncertain stranger into a confident businesswoman, negotiating with suppliers, managing workers, planning expansion. She had a head for numbers that put his own arithmetic to shame, and a way of dealing with people that was both kind and firm. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came, it brought transformation. The ranch began to recover, slowly at first. Then with gathering momentum, Thomas bought more cattle, good breeding stock this time, and repaired the fences and outbuildings. Eleanor's sewing operation grew to employ 8 women, all working in the converted barn that now housed 6 sewing machines and enough fabric to clothe an army. They called it the McKenna Workshop, and its reputation for quality spread across the territory. But success brought its own challenges. A merchant from Helena arrived one day with a proposal to buy them out, to take over the operation and turn it into a factory. He offered more money than Thomas had ever imagined, enough to secure the ranch forever, to live comfortably for the rest of their lives. He spread papers across their kitchen table, pointing to numbers and projections, painting a picture of wealth and ease. Thomas looked at Eleanor, trying to read her expression. This was her creation, her vision made real. The decision should be hers. But Eleanor was looking at the women visible through the window, working in the barn, laughing and talking as they sewed. She thought of how this work had given them purpose and income, how it had transformed not just the ranch but an entire community. "No," Eleanor said finally. "Thank you for the offer. But this isn't just a business. These women depend on this work. This community needs it. We're not interested in selling." The merchant left disappointed, and Thomas felt a surge of pride in something deeper, something he was only beginning to recognize. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, he finally found the courage to speak the words that had been building in his heart. "I need to tell you something," he began. "When you arrived here, I thought I was doing you a kindness, offering you a home. I thought I was the one providing, even though I had almost nothing to give. But you've given me so much more than I ever could have imagined. You've saved this ranch, yes, but you've also saved me. You've shown me that strength isn't just about doing everything yourself. That partnership means building something together that neither of us could create alone." Eleanor reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I came here running from a life I didn't want, looking for a fresh start. I thought I was settling, making the best of limited options. But I've found more than a new beginning. I've found a true home, and more than that, I've found someone who sees me not as a burden or a prize, but as an equal partner." Thomas turned to her, seeing the woman she had become in his eyes, or perhaps the woman she had always been, waiting for the right moment to emerge. "I'm falling in love with you, Eleanor. Maybe I have been since the moment you looked at this falling down ranch and said it had good bones. I'm falling in love with you too," Eleanor whispered. "And I think we're building something with very good bones indeed." They married again that summer, not because the law required it, but because their hearts demanded a new beginning, a celebration of what they had built and what they had become to each other. This time, the church was filled with the women who worked in the barn, the merchants they had partnered with, the railroad workers and loggers who wore Eleanor's sturdy clothes. This time, when Thomas slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, it symbolized not a desperate gamble but a choice freely made, a commitment forged through shared struggle and triumph. The ranch continued to thrive, the cattle operation growing alongside the workshop. They expanded the house, adding rooms for the family they hoped to have someday, building a life that reflected their combined dreams. Eleanor's workshop became a training ground for women across the territory, a place where widows and spinsters and those down on their luck could learn a trade, earn a living, find dignity in skilled work. Thomas managed the ranch with a wisdom that came from having nearly lost it, treating the land and animals with respect and care. Years later, when Thomas and Eleanor sat on that same porch watching their children play in the yard, they would look back on that snowy December day when a mail-order bride arrived with nothing but 2 trunks and a sewing machine. They would marvel at how close they had come to losing everything, and how the thing that saved them wasn't money or luck, but the courage to trust each other, to work together, to build something greater than either of them could have imagined alone. Eleanor's workshop still stood in the converted barn, now run by their eldest daughter, who had inherited her mother's eye for quality and her father's stubborn determination. The McKenna name meant something in Montana, not because of wealth or status, but because of honest work and fair dealing, because of 2 people who had turned desperation into opportunity and strangers into soulmates. The ranch that had once been days away from foreclosure now sprawled across 500 acres. But Thomas and Eleanor never forgot those dark months when every day was a struggle, when failure seemed inevitable. Those memories kept them humble, kept them grateful, kept them reaching out to help others who found themselves in similar straits. They employed those who needed work, extended credit to those who needed time, offered second chances to those who needed hope. On cold winter evenings, when snow fell across the Montana plains just as it had that first December, Thomas would sometimes stand on the porch and remember the fear he had felt watching the stagecoach approach. He had been so certain that bringing Eleanor here was a mistake, that he had nothing to offer, that he was dragging her down into his failure. But she had seen something he couldn't see, had believed in something he had almost given up on. She had brought not just skill and money, but vision and courage, partnership and love. Eleanor would join him on those evenings, slipping her hand into his the way she had 1,000 times before, and they would stand together in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall and feeling grateful for every moment that had led them here. The ranch house glowed warm behind them, filled with life and laughter, built on a foundation of trust and respect and love that had started with a handful of letters and grown into something extraordinary. Their story became legend in the territory, the tale of a desperate rancher and a mail-order bride who saved each other, who turned a failing ranch into a thriving business, who proved that sometimes the things we think will break us are actually the making of us. People would ask Eleanor about those early days, about what gave her the courage to stay when things were so bleak, to risk everything on a stranger and a dying dream. She would smile and say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. She would talk about how the hardest times had forged the strongest bonds, how working together toward a common goal had transformed strangers into true partners. But mostly, she would talk about hope, about the power of believing that tomorrow could be better than today, that with hard work and faith and love, almost anything was possible. Thomas would add that he had learned the most important lesson of his life during those desperate months, that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom, that accepting partnership wasn't surrender but strength. He had thought he needed to save the ranch alone, to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy through solitary struggle. Instead, he had learned that the greatest strength came from two people working together, supporting each other, building something neither could create alone. As the years passed and their hair turned gray, as grandchildren ran through the halls where their children had played, Thomas and Eleanor would still sometimes marvel at the unlikely chain of events that had brought them together. A drought and a death, desperation and determination, a sewing machine and a willingness to take a chance on something unknown. Such small things, such random circumstances, yet they had shaped everything that followed. But perhaps it wasn't random at all, Eleanor would suggest. Perhaps there was some greater design, some pattern they couldn't see but could only trust. Perhaps every hardship had been preparing them for each other, every struggle teaching them lessons they would need for the journey ahead. Perhaps the ranch had to nearly die so that it could be reborn as something better, something built on partnership and equality rather than stubborn pride. Thomas would agree, pulling her close as the snow continued to fall outside, each flake unique and perfect, coming together to create something beautiful. That was what they had done, he would think, two unique people coming together to create something beautiful, something that would last long after they were gone. The McKenna Ranch stood as testament to their journey, every building and fence, every tree and pasture holding memories of the life they had built together. But the true legacy wasn't in the land or the business or the money they had made. It was in the love they had found, the partnership they had forged, the example they had set for their children and grandchildren about what two people could accomplish when they chose to face life together, hand in hand, heart to heart, building something good and true and lasting from the raw materials of hope and hard work and unwavering faith in each other.